she only thought about status. But a cat made her look down. The morning mist clung to the wrought-iron gates of the Whitmore estate like a silk veil, reluctant to lift and reveal the manicured perfection beneath. Clarissa Whitmore, 58 and heir to one of Westport's oldest families, stepped onto her limestone porch with the practiced precision of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. The October air carried the scent of dying roses and wet earth, a reminder that even in her controlled universe, some things insisted on changing. She adjusted her cashmere wrap and surveyed her domain with the critical eye of a museum curator. The boxwood hedges needed trimming. Their edges had grown soft, imprecise. The cobblestone path required fresh pointing. Standards, after all, were what separated the Whitmores from the merely wealthy. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Perfection isn't a goal, darling, it's a responsibility. But as Clarissa lifted her chin to examine the topiary work, something made her look down. A cat sat in the middle of her pristine walkway, as still as a statue and twice as imposing. His fur was the color of storm clouds dusted with ash, and his green eyes held the steady intensity of lighthouse beacons. He didn't meow or move, he simply was, occupying her space with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there. The sight hit her chest like a physical blow, a sharp pang she immediately dismissed as one might brush crumbs from expensive silk. Cats meant complications, mess, unpredictability, everything her ordered life actively avoided. She turned on her heel and retreated into the house, the heavy door closing with a solid thunk that seemed to emphasize the boundary between her world and everything else. Inside, the hallway stretched before her like a perfumed canyon, lined with ancestral portraits and fresh lily arrangements. The silence followed her like an echo of something she didn't want to hear, a reminder of how thoroughly quiet her life had become. When had the house stopped feeling full and started feeling hollow? She pushed the thought away as efficiently as she managed her social calendar. 20 minutes later, driven by a compulsion she couldn't name, Clarissa found herself opening the door again. The cat remained exactly where she'd left him, as if he'd been carved from the morning itself. The name came to her unbidden: Orion. It hung in the air like an unfamiliar word in a foreign language, and she realized her house had grown so accustomed to surnames and titles that it needed to learn how to hold something simple and true. Orion returned every day after that, establishing a routine that both irritated and intrigued her. Clarissa had more pressing matters: a luncheon at the country club to organize, a charity dinner to oversee, a decorating consultation for the library's new wing. These were the pillars that supported her carefully constructed existence, each commitment a brick in the wall that kept her world manageable and her calendar meaningful. Yet each morning, the routine was interrupted by the delicate sound of claws on her welcome mat, not demanding, simply announcing. Clarissa told herself firmly that she wouldn't feed street problems. Strays meant veterinary bills, litter boxes, and the kind of unpredictability that made her mother roll over in her grave. But on a particularly sharp October morning, when the wind cut through her wool coat like a blade, she found herself descending the front steps with a saucer of milk. Orion approached the offering with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easy gifts. He sniffed delicately, then stepped back 2 paces, settling into a patient sit, as if to say he wanted presence, not charity. The gesture was so profoundly dignified that Clarissa felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassment at her own hesitation, at the way her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the saucer closer with the toe of her Italian leather shoe. "I can't get involved," she whispered to the morning air, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Involvement meant mess, meant caring about outcomes she couldn't control. It meant letting something wild and unpredictable into her pristine world. But Orion remained, and somehow his name remained with her too. The first real test came 3 weeks later, during her annual autumn reception. The house blazed with warm light. Crystal glasses caught and threw back the glow of antique chandeliers, and carefully orchestrated laughter rippled through rooms that had been polished to magazine perfection. Clarissa moved through her guests with the practiced grace of someone born to hostess duties, accepting compliments on the hors d'oeuvres and deflecting questions about her conspicuous singleness with well-rehearsed humor. That's when Orion made his dramatic entrance. He walked across the illuminated back garden as if he owned it, stepped through the open French doors, and settled at Clarissa's feet with the quiet authority of a king claiming his throne. The conversation around them stuttered to a halt. Eloise, the housekeeper who'd been with the family for 15 years, appeared in the doorway with a tea towel, her eyebrows knitted in concern. Agatha Leland from the Arts Committee smiled with that particular blend of pity and mockery that wealthy women perfected in finishing school. "Now you're collecting cats too, Clarissa." Agatha's voice carried across the sudden quiet like a dropped wine glass. The heat that flooded Clarissa's face felt like fever. Every eye in the room seemed focused on her, waiting for her response, measuring her reaction against some invisible social barometer. This was exactly what she'd feared. The moment when her controlled world collided with something she couldn't manage or explain away. "Eloise," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest, "please remove the cat." Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Orion left without protest, padding back through the French doors as quietly as he'd arrived. But he left behind a single silver hair on the Persian rug, and somehow that tiny piece of evidence haunted Clarissa for the rest of the evening. She found herself touching the spot with her shoe, aware of its presence even as conversations swirled around her about museum galas and charity auctions. Later, after the last guest had departed and the catering staff had cleared away the evidence of her successful evening, Clarissa stood in her empty living room and felt the weight of her choices settling around her like dust. She'd protected her reputation, maintained her social standing, kept her world exactly as it should be. So why did it feel like she'd lost something irreplaceable? The house seemed to echo her question back at her, its perfect silence no longer comforting but accusatory. Outside, she could hear the October wind rattling the carefully pruned branches of her garden, and for the first time in years, Clarissa Whitmore wondered if protection might be just another word for prison. What would happen, she found herself thinking as she climbed the stairs to her empty bedroom, if she stopped trying so hard to keep everything out? The following weekend brought Nathaniel home from Oakland, his first visit in 8 months. Clarissa watched from her living room window as her son's hybrid pulled through the gates, noting how he'd let his hair grow longer and wondering when he'd stopped calling before these visits. At 42, Nathaniel had inherited his father's height and her own stubborn streak, but none of their need for social architecture. She was arranging white orchids in the foyer when she heard his voice from the garden. "Well, hello there, handsome." Through the window she saw Nathaniel crouched beside the gate, his fingers extended toward a familiar grey shape. Orion approached without his usual caution, allowing himself to be touched, and the sound that emerged was pure contentment, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the morning air. "He chose you," Nathaniel said when Clarissa joined them, his tone carrying equal parts amusement and something deeper. "Cats don't stick around unless they see something worth staying for." Clarissa's response came wrapped in her usual armor of irony, but Nathaniel didn't argue. He simply continued stroking Orion's dusty fur while the cat melted under his attention like ice cream in sunshine. There was something in the tableau that made Clarissa's chest tighten, a naturalness she'd forgotten could exist between living things. Over coffee and her housekeeper's legendary blueberry scones, they settled into the careful dance of family conversation. Nathaniel spoke about his software consulting business, his apartment overlooking the bay, the hiking trails he'd discovered in Marin County. Clarissa updated him on the library fundraiser, the church restoration project, the upcoming Christmas gala planning. But midway through their second cup, Nathaniel set down his spoon and studied his mother with eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of her late husband. "You know, Mom," he said, his voice casual in the way that usually preceded something important, "you've built yourself a beautiful life here, everything perfectly controlled, perfectly presented, but perfect can be another word for lonely." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through conversations she'd been avoiding with herself. Before she could formulate a response, he continued, "You've surrounded yourself with rose gardens and committee meetings and charity galas. It's impressive, really, but roses have thorns, and sometimes I think you've forgotten which side you're touching." The comment hung between them like morning mist, impossible to grasp, but impossible to ignore. When Nathaniel left that afternoon, he spent 10 minutes saying goodbye to Orion, promising to return for Thanksgiving. Clarissa watched from her living room window as his car disappeared down the tree-lined street, then looked down to find the cat still sitting by the gate, as if he understood that some departures were harder than others. That night, She found herself unable to concentrate on the museum board minutes she'd planned to review. Instead, she kept returning to Nathaniel's words, turning them over like stones in her pocket. When had caring become such a foreign concept? When had she started equating emotional investment with vulnerability? The answer came during the first week of November, delivered by the season's initial frost and a stubborn flu that laid her low for 3 miserable days. She'd always prided herself on rarely getting sick, a combination of good genes, expensive vitamins, and a lifestyle that minimized exposure to messy realities. But Tuesday morning found her struggling to breathe through congestion that felt like concrete in her chest. On the second night, she woke at 3 a.m. with a coughing fit that felt like sandpaper in her throat. Desperate for fresh air, she wrapped herself in her warmest robe and opened the front door to gulp at the November cold. That's when she saw Orion, curled against the stone steps with snow dusting his whiskers like powdered sugar. He was shivering, not the dramatic trembling of distress, but the subtle, constant movement of a body fighting to stay warm. His thin frame was pressed against the stone, as if he could absorb warmth from the steps themselves. The sight hit her harder than any coughing spell. Without allowing herself to think, Clarissa padded to the kitchen and filled a bowl with the emergency cat food Eloise kept for just in case. She placed it beside a cardboard box she'd lined with an old cashmere throw, the one her mother had given her for her 30th birthday, now relegated to the closet of things too precious to use. Orion studied the offering with his usual caution, then settled into the box with a sigh that sounded remarkably human. For the first time in days, Clarissa closed the door slowly, as if sudden movements might break something fragile and newly formed. The next morning she woke feeling human again, but the real change wasn't in her congestion. It was in the way she found herself checking the front door, looking for a grey shape that had become part of her daily landscape. When she discovered Orion still curled in his makeshift bed, she felt something shift in her chest. Not the sharp pang of inconvenience she'd expected, but a warm expansion that felt suspiciously like relief. "Well," she murmured, settling onto the front steps despite the cold seeping through her robe, "I suppose you'll need a proper veterinary check." Dr. Calder's office occupied a converted Victorian house 6 blocks away, complete with gingerbread trim and a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and hope. The veterinarian himself was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who treated each animal like a visiting dignitary and their owners like worried family members. The examination revealed what Clarissa had suspected, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Orion carried the history of a hard life in his bones. Old scars traced silver lines through his fur. A poorly healed fracture in his left rear leg explained the subtle limp she'd noticed, and his overall condition suggested months of uncertain meals and unsafe sleeping arrangements. "He's been hit by a car at some point," Dr. Calder explained gently, his hands moving over Orion's body with practiced efficiency. "Probably 6 months to a year ago. See how this leg never set quite right, and these scars along his shoulder suggest he's had to defend himself more than once." The clinical details hit Clarissa like physical blows. She found herself gripping the metal examination table, fighting a wave of something that felt dangerously close to grief. For what? A cat she barely knew, a life of suffering she'd had no part in causing. But as Dr. Calder explained the simple requirements, regular meals, safe shelter, basic medical care, she realized her grief wasn't for Orion's past. It was for all the ways she'd learned to protect herself from exactly this feeling, the terrible, wonderful vulnerability of caring about something fragile and mortal and completely beyond her control. The drive home passed in a blur of practical decisions. She purchased cat food, a proper bed, toys she wasn't sure Orion would use. When they arrived back at the house, Eloise raised an eyebrow, but wordlessly helped arrange a corner of the kitchen near the radiator, complete with food bowls and a scratching post that seemed optimistically large for their new resident. That evening, as snow began to dust the windows and Orion settled into his designated space with obvious relief, Clarissa found herself on the kitchen floor with a book of auction catalogues, reading aloud about 18th century porcelain while her unexpected houseguest dozed nearby. For the first time in years, when sleep finally came, it was deep and dreamless, unmarked by the restless anxiety that usually accompanied her nights. Somewhere between the warmth of the radiator and the soft sound of Orion's breathing, she'd found something she hadn't realized she'd lost: peace. But morning would bring new challenges, and with them, the first real test of how much change she was willing to allow into her carefully constructed world. By December, Orion had woven himself into the fabric of Clarissa's daily routine with the persistence of morning coffee and the subtlety of changing seasons. He'd claimed her study as his afternoon territory, settling himself across whatever magazines or catalogues she'd spread out for planning the spring charity events. His technique was masterful, a casual sprawl that covered exactly the pages she needed most, combined with an innocent expression that suggested pure coincidence. "You're doing this on purpose," she'd tell him, and he'd respond with a slow blink that somehow managed to convey both guilt and complete lack of remorse. But it was his gifts that truly undid her carefully maintained boundaries. Every few days, Orion would appear with some small offering from the garden, a fallen leaf with particularly striking color, a smooth pebble from the path, once an entire small branch of holly that he'd somehow maneuvered through the cat door Eloise had reluctantly installed. These treasures invariably found their way onto her Persian rugs, leaving traces of earth and authenticity on surfaces that had known only professional cleaning for decades. The paradox wasn't lost on her. As Orion made her pristine house slightly messier, something inside her felt cleaner than it had in years. His presence demanded nothing but offered everything: companionship without agenda, loyalty without contracts, affection without social calculation. Then came the June charity gala, and with it the price of being seen as different. The event was Clarissa's pride, a perfectly orchestrated evening that raised significant funds for the Children's Hospital while showcasing Westport's finest in their most generous light. She'd spent months coordinating with caterers, florists, and musicians, ensuring every detail reflected the sophisticated taste that had become her calling card. The evening began flawlessly. Women in designer gowns mingled with men in perfect tuxedos, champagne flutes caught the light from crystal chandeliers, and conversations flowed with the practiced ease of people who'd been performing these social dances since childhood. Clarissa moved through the crowd with her usual grace, accepting compliments on the arrangements and deflecting attention from herself toward the cause they'd gathered to support. That's when Agatha Leland, resplendent in emerald silk and diamond earrings, approached with her signature smile, the one that preceded social surgery performed without anesthesia. "Clarissa, darling," Agatha began, her voice carrying just far enough to attract nearby attention, "I've been hearing the most amusing stories about your new philanthropic project." The emphasis on philanthropic was surgical in its precision, designed to draw listeners while maintaining plausible innocence. Clarissa felt her social radar activate, recognizing the setup even as she smiled her practiced response. "The hospital fundraiser has been wonderfully supported this year," she replied smoothly, attempting to redirect the conversation towards safer ground. But Agatha was just warming up. "Oh, not the hospital, dear. I mean your other charitable work. The feline philanthropy?" Her laugh was like breaking glass. "Patricia Morrison's housekeeper mentioned seeing you at that little veterinary clinic on Maple Street, with your rescued cat companion, no less." The words landed in the conversational lull like stones in a still pond. Suddenly, Clarissa felt the weight of watching eyes, the subtle shift that occurred when society sensed a story in the making. Her face burned with the kind of adolescent embarrassment she thought she'd outgrown decades ago. "Animal welfare is important," she managed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Of course it is," Agatha agreed with theatrical enthusiasm, "though I must say it's quite a departure from your usual elevated concerns. But then, we all need hobbies as we get older, don't we?" The conversation moved on, but the damage was done. Clarissa could feel the story taking shape around her, transforming from whispered speculation to established fact through the mysterious alchemy of social gossip. By the evening's end, she was certain half of Westport's social elite would know that Clarissa Whitmore had taken in a stray cat and was apparently volunteering at some common veterinary clinic. The drive home felt longer than usual, despite the familiar streets and well-known landmarks. When she arrived at her house, Orion wasn't waiting by the door as he usually was. Not that night, not the next morning. For the first time since he'd appeared in her life, he was simply gone. The following 2 weeks passed in a blur of desperate searching. Clarissa found herself in parts of Westport she'd never seen, putting up hand-drawn flyers with Orion's photo and her phone number. She called animal shelters in 3 counties, drove through neighborhoods that existed just blocks from her mansion, but might as well have been foreign countries. Her hands, usually immaculately manicured, became dirty and rough from handling fences and opening gates. She wandered through areas where delivery trucks parked and workers took their lunch breaks, asking questions of people she'd never imagined speaking to before. The search stripped away layers of pretense she hadn't realized she'd built up. When the manager of a landscaping company spent 20 minutes helping her search behind his equipment shed, she was struck by his genuine concern for a cat he'd never seen. When the teenager working at the corner market offered to post her flyer in his window without being asked, she felt something crack open in her chest. These people, whose names she'd never learned, whose stories she'd never wondered about, were showing more kindness to a stranger than her social circle had shown to her in years. The realization was both humbling and revelatory. On the 14th day, when she'd nearly given up hope, she heard a familiar sound behind the farmer's market loading dock, a rough, tired meow that made her heart stutter. There was Orion, thinner than when he'd left, his left leg dragging more noticeably than before. He looked at her with eyes that held no accusation, only the weary relief of someone who'd been wandering and had finally found home. Clarissa dropped to her knees on the gravel, unmindful of her expensive trousers or the oil stains on the asphalt. When Orion limped into her arms, she buried her face in his dusty fur and inhaled deeply. He smelled like rain and motor oil and survival, and somehow it was the most expensive perfume in the world. The drive to Dr. Calder's office was silent, except for Orion's occasional purr from his carrier. The veterinarian's examination revealed cuts and bruises, but nothing permanently damaging, the resilience of a survivor showing through once again. "Where do you think he went?" Clarissa asked as Dr. Calder cleaned a superficial wound on Orion's shoulder. "Hard to say," the older man replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes animals need to process their own changes. He's been living rough for a long time. Trust doesn't come easily when you've learned the world can be dangerous." The words hung in the air between them, and Clarissa realized they could have been describing herself just as easily as Orion. When had she learned to see kindness as dangerous? When had opening her heart started feeling like opening a wound? That night she cancelled her standing brunch appointment and called Dr. Calder back. By the end of the conversation, she'd agreed to fund a weekly community clinic for pet owners who couldn't afford regular veterinary care. It wasn't charity in the abstract, the kind that came with galas and tax benefits and social recognition. It was help in the specific, messy, complicated way that required showing up and getting your hands dirty. The first clinic session was held the following Saturday in a converted garage behind Dr. Calder's practice. Clarissa arrived early, wearing old jeans and a sweater she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Orion came too, settling himself in a sunny corner where he could observe the proceedings with his characteristic quiet authority. 12 people showed up that first day, bringing elderly dogs and young cats, birds with broken wings, and rabbits with digestive issues. Clarissa found herself holding a nervous terrier while Dr. Calder examined his ears, learning that the dog's owner worked 3 jobs and had been choosing between medication for herself and vaccinations for her pet. By the end of the day, Clarissa's back ached from lifting carriers, and her shoes were scuffed from the concrete floor, but something inside her felt lighter than it had in years. She was tired in the way that comes from meaningful work rather than social performance, and for the first time in memory, she was looking forward to next Saturday instead of the next dinner party. As they locked up the clinic, Dr. Calder paused beside her car. "You know," he said quietly, "Orion's not the only one who found a home today." Driving back to her mansion with her sleeping cat beside her, Clarissa realized he was right. Somewhere between searching for Orion in unfamiliar neighborhoods and holding frightened animals in a converted garage, she'd begun to find her way back to something she'd lost without realizing it. Herself. But the real test was still coming. By Monday morning, news of her clinic volunteering would have reached the country club, and she would have to decide what mattered more, the opinion of people who'd never held a sick animal or the warm weight of purpose settling into her bones. The phone call came Tuesday morning, while Clarissa was having coffee with Orion curled in his favorite spot by the kitchen window. Agatha Leland's voice carried its usual tone of concerned authority, the sound of someone delivering unfortunate news for the recipient's own good. "Clarissa, darling, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but several of us have been talking." The pause that followed was perfectly calculated, long enough to suggest reluctance while ensuring maximum drama. "About your recent activities." Clarissa set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, watching Orion's ears twitch as if he could sense the tension in her voice. Which activities would those be, Agatha? Well, the animal clinic, of course. Word travels, you know. And while we all admire charitable impulses, some of us are concerned about how this reflects on the organizations we represent together. There it was, the gentle threat wrapped in silk, the reminder that her social standing wasn't just personal, but connected to a web of committees, boards and institutions that had defined her identity for decades. Clarissa found herself standing, pacing to the window where she could see the garden where Orion had first appeared. "I see," she said carefully. "And what specifically concerns you?" Agatha's sigh was theatrical. "Darling, you know how these things work. Your family name carries weight. It always has. But associating with, well, let's call them common concerns, it changes how people see us all. The country club board is reconsidering your nomination for next year's presidency. The museum trustees are wondering about your commitment to their vision. These things matter." The words settled around Clarissa like a familiar cage, one she'd lived in so long she'd forgotten it had bars. For 30 years, she'd carefully cultivated her reputation, chosen her associations, managed her image like a valuable stock portfolio. The threat was real. She could lose her social standing, her committee positions, her carefully constructed identity as someone who mattered in Westport's rarefied circles. "I understand," she said finally. "Thank you for the warning." "Oh, it's not a warning, dear. It's an opportunity. Simply step back from this clinic project, let it find other sponsors, and everything returns to normal. No one thinks less of you for wanting to help animals, but there are more appropriate ways to channel those impulses." After Agatha hung up, Clarissa remained by the window, watching clouds gather over her perfectly manicured garden. Orion appeared at her feet, looking up with those steady green eyes that had become her moral compass. What would he do in this situation? The question was absurd, but somehow it felt like the most important one she'd asked in years. That afternoon, she drove to the clinic for her regular Saturday shift, but her mind kept circling back to Agatha's call. The threats weren't idle. She'd seen other people quietly edged out of social circles for failing to maintain appropriate standards. Mrs. Patterson, who'd gotten too involved with immigrant services. James Worthington, who'd spoken too passionately about housing reform. They were still wealthy, still respectable, but they were no longer central. The clinic was busier than usual. Maria, the single mother whose 3 children came with her when she brought their elderly cat for checkups, was there with a new concern. Dr. Calder examined the cat while the youngest child, maybe 6 years old, asked Clarissa endless questions about Orion, who'd established himself as the clinic's unofficial greeter. "Why does he stay with you?" the little boy asked, his hand gentle on Orion's head. "I think," Clarissa said slowly, surprising herself with the honesty, "because I needed him more than I knew." After the clinic closed, she found herself lingering in the converted garage, ostensibly organizing supplies but really trying to make sense of the choice ahead of her. Through the window, she could see Dr. Calder helping Maria load her cat carrier into a truck that had seen better decades. The woman worked as a hotel housekeeper, he'd mentioned, and had driven 40 minutes to bring her cat to the clinic because the regular veterinarian was beyond her budget. On Sunday, Clarissa made her decision. The call to Agatha was brief. She thanked her for the concern, acknowledged the social consequences, and politely declined to step back from the clinic. Then she called her lawyer and arranged to establish a formal foundation for low-cost veterinary care, with herself as the primary board member and funding source. The response was swift and exactly as predicted. By Wednesday, she'd received a formal letter informing her that her nomination for the country club presidency had been withdrawn. The museum board suggested she might be too busy to continue her role as chair of the acquisitions committee. 3 separate charity galas found reasons why her usual sponsorship level might not be appropriate this year. For someone who'd spent decades measuring her worth by such recognition, the rejection should have been devastating. Instead, Clarissa found herself surprisingly calm. The morning after the museum board's letter arrived, she sat in her kitchen with her coffee and legal pad, planning an expansion of the clinic services while Orion supervised from his sunny windowsill. The real test came the following weekend, when she encountered Margaret Thornbury at the grocery store. Margaret had been her closest friend for 20 years, their relationship built on shared committee work and complementary social ambitions. They'd vacationed together, served on boards together, raised their children in parallel social orbits. "Clarissa," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral, "I was sorry to hear about your transitions." "Thank you," Clarissa replied, genuinely unsure how to navigate this new social territory. "It's been an interesting few weeks." Margaret glanced around the produce section as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You know, everyone's talking about it. Some people think you've had some sort of breakdown. Others think it's a midlife crisis." The words stung more than Clarissa expected, not because they were cruel, but because they reduced her choices to pathology. In Margaret's world, choosing service over status was evidence of mental instability rather than moral clarity. "And what do you think?" Clarissa asked. Margaret's pause was long enough to be painful. "I think you're throwing away 30 years of careful positioning for a cat and some sick animals. I don't understand it, and frankly, it makes the rest of us uncomfortable." That evening, Clarissa found herself sitting on her front steps despite the November cold, with Orion settled warm against her side. The house behind them was the same as always, perfectly appointed, immaculately maintained, ready for photographs that would never be taken now that she was no longer socially relevant. But something fundamental had shifted. The silence no longer felt hollow, it felt peaceful. The perfection no longer felt impressive, it felt sterile. And the cat beside her, with his battle scars and imperfect posture, felt more real than anything else in her carefully curated world. "What do you think?" she asked Orion, who responded with a purr that rumbled through both their bodies. "Are we crazy to choose this?" As if in answer, a car pulled up to the curb. "Doctor." Calder emerged with a smile and a small carrier. "Sorry to bother you at home," he said, approaching the steps, "but we had an emergency surrender today. Someone found this little one hit by a car, and the owner couldn't afford surgery. I thought maybe—" He opened the carrier to reveal a tiny orange kitten, one leg in a splint, eyes bright with pain but also unmistakable trust. Clarissa looked at Orion, who studied the newcomer with the grave consideration of someone making an important decision. Then Orion moved closer to the carrier, touched his nose to the bars, and began to purr. "Well," Clarissa said, reaching for the carrier, "I suppose we have room for one more." As they settled the kitten in the warm kitchen, with Orion maintaining protective watch nearby, Clarissa realized she'd found her answer. She might have lost her social standing, but she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: the ability to say yes to what mattered. By spring, the Whitmore Foundation for Animal Care had outgrown the converted garage behind Dr. Calder's practice and moved into a former auto repair shop on the other side of town. The space was far from elegant: concrete floors, fluorescent lighting, and the persistent smell of motor oil that no amount of cleaning could entirely eliminate. But it hummed with the kind of purposeful energy that Clarissa had spent years seeking in museum galas and charity luncheons. She'd traded her designer suits for scrubs and comfortable shoes, her manicured nails for hands that bore the small scratches and stains that came from handling frightened animals. The change hadn't happened overnight. There had been mornings when she'd stood before her closet, reaching automatically for silk blouses and tailored jackets, before remembering she was spending the day cleaning kennels and helping Dr. Calder with examinations. Orion had adapted to the new routine with typical feline pragmatism, establishing himself as the clinic's unofficial therapy animal. He'd somehow learned to distinguish between animals who needed space and those who craved comfort, positioning himself accordingly throughout the day. The orange kitten, now grown into a confident young cat named Phoenix, had become his devoted apprentice, mimicking his calm presence with the dedication of someone learning an important trade. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. The clientele had grown beyond Clarissa's initial expectations. Maria still brought her elderly cat for checkups, but now she was joined by construction workers with injured strays, elderly residents on fixed incomes who'd found abandoned kittens, and teenagers whose families couldn't afford emergency care for beloved pets. Each story was a thread in a tapestry of genuine need that made her previous charitable work seem like elaborate social theatre. On this particular April morning, Clarissa arrived at the clinic to find Nathaniel's car already in the parking lot. Her son leaned against the building's brick wall, 2 coffee cups in his hands, and an expression of bemused pride on his face. "Mum," he said, offering her one of the cups, "you realize this place looks nothing like the country club." "Thank goodness for that," she replied, accepting the coffee and breathing in the familiar scent of morning and possibility. "When did you get into town?" "Last night. I wanted to see this transformation everyone's been telling me about." His eyes swept over the modest building with its hand-painted sign and mismatched furniture visible through the front window. "From the outside, it doesn't look like much." "Wait until you see what happens inside," Clarissa said, unlocking the front door and stepping into the space that had become more home to her than her mansion ever had. Nathaniel spent the morning shadowing her through the clinic's routines, watching as she helped Dr. Calder examine a nervous pit bull whose owner had saved for months to afford the visit, held a carrier steady while a volunteer cleaned the cage of a recovering pigeon, and patiently explained medication schedules to an elderly man whose arthritic hands made opening pill bottles a challenge. "You're different here," he observed during a quiet moment between appointments. "Different how?" "Present. Like you're actually inhabiting your life instead of performing it." The observation settled around her as they worked through the afternoon schedule. It was true. Somewhere between learning to read animal behavior and discovering that scraped knees could heal without professional attention, she'd stopped being so careful about appearances and started focusing on actual results. The day's most challenging case arrived just before closing. A young woman barely out of her teens, carrying a cardboard box that moved with weak, desperate sounds. Inside were 3 newborn puppies, eyes still closed, who'd been found beside their dead mother behind a restaurant. The young woman, her name was Ashley, had spent her last $20 on puppy formula at the pet store, but she had no idea how to care for such young animals. "I work 2 jobs, she explained, tears threatening to spill over. "I can't afford a real vet, but I couldn't just leave them there to die." Dr. Calder examined the tiny creatures with gentle efficiency, while Clarissa found herself automatically moving into a supporting role that had become second nature. She prepared warming blankets, mixed formula to the proper temperature, and demonstrated feeding techniques, while Nathaniel watched from the corner, his expression thoughtful. "They'll need feeding every 2 hours for the next several weeks," Dr. Calder explained. "It's like caring for human babies, constant attention, especially at night." Ashley's face fell. I want to help them, but I work nights at the diner and days at the hardware store. I don't have anyone to—" "I'll take them," Clarissa heard herself say, surprising everyone, including herself, "just until they're old enough to find homes." The drive back to her house was quiet, except for the soft sounds from the box of puppies on the passenger seat. Nathaniel followed in his car, and together they set up a makeshift nursery in the kitchen, complete with heating pad, feeding supplies, and blankets that Orion investigated with scientific curiosity. "Are you sure about this?" Nathaniel asked as they watched Orion carefully sniff each puppy before settling nearby in protective supervision mode. 3 newborns is a serious commitment. Clarissa looked around her kitchen, once a showpiece of marble counters and designer appliances, now cheerfully cluttered with pet supplies and medical equipment, and realized she'd never been more certain of anything. "A year ago, I measured my days by social obligations and committee meetings," she said. "Everything was planned months in advance, every interaction carefully calculated for maximum social benefit. I thought I was living a full life, but really I was just existing in a very expensive bubble." She picked up one of the sleeping puppies, marveling at how something so small could feel so substantial. "These little ones don't care about my family name or my social connections. They just need someone to show up, to be present, to care about their survival from one day to the next. It's the most real thing I've done in decades." Nathaniel smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and reminded her of the little boy who'd once brought home every injured creature he could find. "Dad would have liked this version of you," he said quietly. The comment hit unexpectedly deep. Her late husband had been gone for 8 years now, long enough that his absence had stopped feeling acute and settled into a permanent background ache. But she realized that somewhere in the process of caring for Orion and building the clinic, she'd begun to remember not just the loss, but the love that had preceded it. "He always said I was at my best when I stopped trying so hard to be impressive," she admitted. "I spent so many years after he died trying to maintain the life we'd built together that I forgot to keep living." That night, she set her alarm for every 2 hours and settled into the rhythm of night feedings that would define the next several weeks. Orion appointed himself co-caretaker, positioning himself near the puppy's box and alerting her with soft chirps when feeding time approached. Phoenix contributed by bringing various toys to the nursery, apparently convinced that the puppies would eventually want to play with catnip mice and feather wands. The middle-of-the-night feedings became a meditation of sorts. In the quiet kitchen, with only the sound of tiny mouths working at bottles and Orion's reassuring purr, Clarissa found herself thinking about the path that had led her here. The social rejection that had felt so devastating months ago now seemed like a gift, freedom from expectations that had never really been her own. 3 weeks later, the puppies had grown into roly-poly bundles of energy that treated Orion with the reverence due to a benevolent deity. Nathaniel had extended his visit, working remotely while helping with puppy care and observing what he called his mother's complete transformation into someone I actually recognize. The morning Agatha Leland appeared at the clinic was sunny and warm, spring asserting itself through every window and doorway. Clarissa was in the back room, sterilizing equipment while the puppies napped in their expanded play area under Orion's watchful eye, when Dr. Calder came to find her. "You have a visitor," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Mrs. Leland is in the front office." Clarissa found Agatha examining the clinic's modest waiting area with the expression of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. Her former friend wore what Clarissa now recognized as social armor, perfectly coordinated outfit, flawless makeup, the kind of posture that announced importance before any words were spoken. "Agatha," she said simply, "this is unexpected." "Indeed." Agatha's smile was practiced but strained. "I wanted to see for myself what you've been building here." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of their severed friendship settling between them like dust. Finally, Agatha spoke again. "I came to tell you that the country club board has reconsidered their decision about your membership. Given your family's long history with the organization, they're prepared to reinstate all privileges if you're willing to step back from this project." The offer hung in the air between them, and Clarissa realized she was looking at a version of herself from a year ago, someone who measured worth by membership in exclusive institutions, who equated social standing with personal value, who'd forgotten that the best parts of life happened when you stopped performing and started caring. "That's very generous," she said finally, "but I'm afraid I'll have to decline." Agatha's carefully maintained composure slipped slightly. "Clarissa, you're throwing away 30 years of social capital for what? Animals that don't even belong to you? People who can't afford to pay for proper veterinary care?" "I'm trading 30 years of social capital for something I never had before," Clarissa replied. "The ability to sleep soundly because I know I spent the day making a real difference in the world." As if summoned by the conversation, Orion appeared from the back room, padding silently across the linoleum floor to settle at Clarissa's feet. His presence was both comfort and reminder. This was where the transformation had begun, with a grey cat who'd refused to accept that gates and barriers were permanent. Agatha looked down at him with barely concealed distaste. "All this for a stray cat?" "Not for him," Clarissa said, reaching down to stroke Orion's head. "Because of him. He taught me the difference between a life that looks perfect and one that actually is." After Agatha left, shaking her head at what she clearly considered temporary insanity, Clarissa sat in the clinic's small office with Orion in her lap and Phoenix curled nearby. The puppies had woken from their nap and were tumbling over each other in their play area, supervised by 2 cats who'd somehow learned to co-parent across species lines. 6 months ago, she'd been living in perfect isolation, maintaining a flawless facade, while her soul withered from lack of genuine connection. Now her life was messier, noisier, more complicated, and more real than it had been in decades. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ashley, the young woman who'd brought the puppies. "How are my babies doing? I've been saving money for when they're ready for homes. I think I can afford to keep one." Clarissa smiled as she typed her response, watching Orion's eyes close in contentment and listening to the sound of young animals learning to trust the world. Outside, spring was painting Westport in shades of green and gold, and inside, she'd finally learned the most important lesson of her 58 years, that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually need. The grey cat who'd appeared at her gate hadn't been looking for rescue. He'd been offering it. And in learning to care for him, she'd discovered how to care for herself, not the performance version that had sustained her for decades, but the authentic self that had been waiting patiently for someone brave enough to look down from the heights of status and see what was really there all along. As evening settled over the clinic and they prepared to go home, all of them together, this unlikely family of species and circumstance, Clarissa realized that Orion had given her the rarest gift imaginable, the courage to become who she was always meant to be.